So I'm going to be talking about what we understand about bias in peer review at the NIH and what CSR is doing to combat it. So let's see, let's get the slides to advance. There we go. Okay. So let's start with the data and what the literature says, focusing on, again, peer review at the NIH. As probably all of you know, in 2011, Donna Ginther published a paper that showed that African-American scientists are substantially less likely to be awarded an R01 compared to their white counterparts. This basic observation was replicated. It was extended in multiple papers over the ensuing decade. This gap in funding is substantial. It's on the order of 50%, and at least through 2020, it had not improved at all. So probably because at the NIH overall, there is a close relationship between review outcomes and funding decisions, many people assumed that if there's a funding disparity, it must be due to bias in peer review. Ginther herself was very cautious about that. She was skeptical of that explanation, but many others were not. And there have been many commentators who argue that peer review. I'm picking up somebody. Anyway, so many commentators have argued that peer review is racially biased. And so, for example, this cartoon comes from the Stevens et al. Commentary in Cell last year, Fund Black Scientists. And you can see the argument that the NIH racial funding disparity is a result of biased peer reviewers pushing their African-American colleagues off the cliffs of academia. So the observation was about funding gap. The interpretation was that it was review bias. But this paper, which did come out of the NIH, purported to find that there is reviewer bias, not on the basis of race per se, but on the basis of topic choice. So Hopp and colleagues made a number of important observations. So one was that applications from African-American scientists are concentrated in a small number of topics. So what they did was they took a large batch of NIH applications, and using natural language processing, they grouped them into about 150 topic clusters. And then they looked at the percent of applications within each of those clusters that came from African-American scientists. And that's this very skewed distribution that you're looking at here. So obviously there's a lot of topics where the representation of African-American scientists is like vanishingly small, but there's a small number of topics where you do get pretty significant number of applications from Black scientists. In fact, if you take the first 15 of these topics, those 15 topics alone account for over 50% of the applications that come from Black scientists. So let's just call those African-American preferred topics. So Hopp and colleagues then also observed that the award rates differ fourfold across these different topics. And that basically the award rates for these topics, these favored topics, are relatively low. So topic choice alone in their analyses accounted for over 20% of the NIH funding gap. And their bottom line conclusion was that the reason for this was bias on the part of reviewers, that reviewers seem to prefer certain topics over others. So they were right about all their first observations, but they were wrong about this conclusion. And they were wrong about it because they left out one important variable, and that was individual IC award rates. So in this 2021 paper, Mike Lauer and colleagues, also from NIH, of course, took that into account and took another look at the exact same data set that HOP had used. And when you do that, here's what you find. Three things: that African American preferred topics are unevenly distributed across the ICs. Of course, funding rates across the ICs also vary, about threefold. And African American preferred topics are primarily funded by ICs with relatively low funding rates. So if you map this out, this is what it looks like. So on the abscissa here is plotted each IC according to the percentage of applications they get that come on these African American preferred topics. And on the ordinate, you have the IC award rate. So what you see is that there are some ICs that get relatively large number of applications on these topics, and their award rates are pretty low. And on the other hand, you have other institutes that get very few applications on these topics and have relatively high award rates. And so when you take this into account, that explains this topic choice effect. And so the conclusion of the Lauer paper was that, yes, topic choice matters, but primarily because of their assignment to the ICs, not to peer review preferences. And they did look specifically at peer review outcomes for these preferred topics versus other topics, saw no difference at all. So you don't see evidence of reviewer bias on the basis of topic choice, but back to the sort of core argument, is there identity-based bias in NIH peer review? There's not a lot of literature on it. This study, which we call CSR's Anonymization study and was published last year, is a large-scale experimental test trying to get at that issue. So let me walk you through it. So this study used 3 sets of real NIH applications. 400 R01s came from Black PIs, and then there were 2 comparator sets. There were 400 from white PIs that were matched to those from the Black PIs on some review relevant features. And then there was another randomly selected set of 400 from white PIs. They took these actual applications and they were redacted by study personnel to remove indicators of personal identity and institutional affiliation. Then the standard format and the redacted versions underwent simulated peer review. We looked at peer review outcomes, and reviewers were asked also to guess the PI race, gender, and name after they completed their critiques. So what were the effects of redaction? A couple of key findings. So first, redaction reduced the accuracy of reviewers' guesses of PI race for Black, but not for white applicants. So if you look at this table, here's actual PI race. And so you see that with standard applications, the reviewers were able to accurately guess the race of the PI 59% of the time. When the information was redacted, that fell to about 30%. So it did significantly reduce reviewers' knowledge of the PI race for Black applicants. But for white applicants, whether it's the matched sample or the random sample, looking at standard applications, reviewers were extremely good at guessing the race correctly. And with redacted applications, they were extremely good at accurately guessing the race. So it made no difference there. So what about review outcomes? Redaction made the scores worse for white applicants, but not for Black applicants. So what you're looking at here are box and whisker plots of the data. The yellow boxes are for the standard format applications. The blue boxes are for the redacted. The scale here is the standard NIH scale that we use for overall impact. 1 is the best, 9 is the worst. And so if you look over here at the far left column, these are the results for applications from Black PIs. And you can see that redaction made no difference whatsoever in the scores for these applications. But it did make a difference for both of the white samples. So here's the matched sample for white applications, and you can see the redacted scores get higher, that's worse. And again, for the random sample, redaction made the scores worse. So the other thing I'll point out, it's a little bit hard looking at the raw data here, but overall, the applications from white PIs did score better than those from Black PIs. So the X's here are the means, and so if you look in the yellow boxes, you can kind of see it. Both of these white samples scored somewhat better. And redaction does not eliminate that difference, but it cuts it about in half. So what do these data say about the nature of bias in NIH peer review? You see very little evidence of anti-Black bias in review based on PI race per se. However, you do see that the applications from white PIs scored better than those from Black PIs, and that redaction reduces that advantage. So what could be going on? So one explanation is halo effects. So by halo effects, I mean the situation in which the glow of a big name leads the reviewer to give overly good scores. And who is going to benefit from that? That's going to benefit the people with the big names. Who are those? Those are typically senior, well-established PIs, and they are predominantly non-Hispanic white PIs. And so this is a form of bias. This voting on the basis of PI or institutional reputation is a form of bias which tends to favor, they say, well-established non-Hispanic white PIs. And so, so the point is that with redaction, when you take away that advantage, the scores get worse. And that could explain the findings that you see. So this kind of phenomenon could be particularly important at the NIH because 2 of the 5 review criteria, which are legally required of us, 2 of them are investigator and environment. So reviewers have to take these factors into account in judging the overall impact of the grant. And so it's a particular issue for us. So what can we do about this? CSR's taken multiple steps to try to combat this sort of bias, which, just to be clear, I think this sort of reputational bias is the most significant, most common kind of bias that we see in peer review at NIH. And it's often an explicit bias. So what can you do about it? These are the initiatives. So one of the things that we're looking at is partially blinded review processes. So for example, we have a 3-year pilot underway in conjunction with the Common Fund, looking at the review of the NIH Director's Transformative Research Awards. So this RFA gets a large number of applications on a huge range of science. And we review it using an editorial board format. And the key thing to understand is that in this format, you take this large initial pool of applications, and in a series of steps, it's winnowed down to a very small set of finalists. And only the finalists go forward to the meeting where everyone is discussed and scored. So in this pilot, all of those initial steps prior to the meeting, the whole process of winnowing it down to the finalists, is done without information about who or where the application comes from. So the RFA requires that the applicants write the abstract, the specific aims, and the research plan in a way that makes it extremely difficult to identify who or where it comes from. And we do check this. And then it's only at this last stage when hopefully key decisions or judgments about the importance and quality of the science have already been made is the identity revealed. So how is this working? We'll see. We're halfway into this pilot. There's an external contractor that's taking a look at it, and we've gotten some interesting preliminary data, but we'll, it's to be seen. Another thing that we've been working at is we have been thinking about what you could do with the definition and the structure of the review criteria themselves. So a couple of years ago, CSR's Advisory Council convened 2 working groups, and they asked these groups to think about simplifying review criteria with 2 goals. One was to reduce the burden on reviewers, and the second, more important one, is to improve the quality of review. So one of these groups took a look at general RPG review criteria, and the other one focused on the criteria for clinical trials. Both of them made this major recommendation, which was that we should reorganize the current 5 scored review criteria into 3 factors. Those 3 factors being the importance of the science, its feasibility and rigor, and then the investigators and environment. So the idea behind organizing things into these factors is to really clearly focus reviewers' attention on the crucial judgments that they need to make about each application. How important is the research? How feasible and rigorous is it? And so the other thing that I would point out is that this structure lends itself to having those critical judgments made without, or at least separately from, this information and judgments about the investigators and environment. And so it lends itself to that sort of multi-stage, partially blinded review process that I just described to you. So that's something that we'll be looking at going forward. Another way that we've come at bias and trying to reduce it is through training. So CSR has launched a bias awareness and mitigation training for reviewers. If you haven't seen it, you should. It's a 30-minute training. It's aimed at raising awareness and providing tools to mitigate bias. It targets the most common biases in peer review process. So it focuses on these reputational kind of biases. And it's not general implicit bias training. So far, we've invited over 15,000 reviewers to take this training shortly in advance of their review meetings. And now about almost 11,000 of them have done so. The training has been really well received. We get some nice comments in social media, but more to the point, when we survey people after they've taken the training, we get indications that they think that this training will make a difference for them. So, for example, if you ask them, did the training, how much did the training help you in identifying potential bias in review? 90% of respondents said that it improved their ability to do so to a moderate, large, or very large degree. And similarly, if you ask them, did it make you, how much more comfortable are you in intervening when you see bias? Again, 90% of the respondents are saying that it made them significantly more comfortable in doing so. And we do hear and see instances now in review committees where we see these ideas playing out. Chairs have a really important role in setting the tone and the culture of study sections. And so we're making sure that chairs really appreciate these ideas and incorporate it into their practice. So every summer, about 90 new study section chairs start their 2-year terms. We require that all of them take part in a 2-hour small group interactive orientation session. And starting last year, we made this bias awareness and mitigation training part of it. This year, we'll do so in a bigger way, really focusing on their critical role as a chair and the influence they have in setting and changing the study section culture. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge the working group that put that training together. They did a really nice job. Okay, another initiative is to make it easier for people to report bias when they see it. CSR does a lot of review. We know that things go wrong at times. And when it does, we want to know about it. And we really want people to understand that if they see something, if they see bias or anything else that could affect the fairness of review, we want to hear about it. And so we've established what we call this bias box. It's a bias reporting email. It goes to our Associate Director for Workforce Diversity. And we've really made multiple efforts to publicize this. So it's on the signature line of every outgoing staff email. It's on the highly trafficked pages of our website. But more than that, and this, I guess the key message here, and that I hope people begin to appreciate, that when we hear about bias or flaws in review, if we agree that something went wrong, we will try to fix it, and we will fix it by re-reviewing the application within the same round. In other words, we will not send it for appeal. We will take it on ourselves to fix it by re-reviewing it as rapidly as possible. So we are often told that we ought to be making our study sections more diverse, and we agree. So here's how we're working at doing that. First, in terms of working with our staff, we have put a lot of effort into raising collective awareness. We really want our staff to understand the critical importance of diversity and the link between diversity and excellence in review. So this is a message we work at helping people understand. We set expectations. We monitor the data. So you could look at this as we push people to diversify, but you can't just push people. You need to help people find new reviewers. And so we've put significant effort into building up databases to bring in new sources of potential reviewers in this reviewer finder. And we've emphasized a lot of training for SROs in how you do this. So let me just show you briefly this tool that we've developed. So this is a searchable tool according to expertise and various other characteristics of reviewers that helps SROs find potential reviewers. So NIH has a big database that has records on everybody who has ever submitted a grant application to the NIH. And it's this database that SROs typically go to find reviewers. So we understand that when you look in an NIH database for people to review NIH grant applications, there's kind of a closed loop aspect to that, and that if you really want to diversify your panels, you need to make efforts to get outside of that. And so we have, by bringing in multiple additional sources of data, of names. So for example, we have our early career reviewer program. We've asked the institutes for their recommendations about potential reviewers. We've gone to professional societies and their minority interest groups and asked them for names. And this one is important. So we've added over 11,000 names of people who are funded by other agencies. So these might be NSF, they might be DOD, CDC, or some of the major private foundations. And so in aggregate, we've added over 24,000 names to this sort of core NIH database. And in so doing, brought a lot of new names to SRO awareness. And these efforts are making some difference. It's not an easy task. So what you're looking at here is a graph of the percent of women on CSR rosters over the last, this is over the last 3 years. The gray line here is the percent of applications that were reviewed by CSR in the May Council round that came from women. So it's 33%. The green line is the percent of women on our standing panel rosters. And the red line is the percent of women on our special emphasis panels. And you can see that both are gradually trending up. Similarly, if you look at the percent of underrepresented minorities on our rosters, the reference point here, this 8.8%, that's the percent of applications CSR reviewed in the May Council that came from underrepresented minorities. Again, the green line is percent on our standing panels, and the red line is on our special emphasis panels. So again, we are seeing progress on this. And then finally, just to mention an additional effort that we're undertaking at this point. Excuse me. So CSR reviews over 90% of the fellowship applications that come to NIH. And so the next thing we're looking at is fellowship review. And the Advisory Council has convened another work group, charging the work group with examining the fellowship review criteria and process with an aim towards making it as fair and open as possible. So that's an effort underway and be playing out over the next year or so. So let me pause at this point. I'll take down my slides so I can come